Blog Talk Radio.
You are now listening to True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. Gacy, Bundy, Dahmer, The Night Stalker, BTK. Every week, another fascinating author talking about the most shocking and infamous killers in true crime history. True Murder, with your host, journalist and author, Dan Zupansky.
Good evening, this is your host, Dan Zupansky, for the program True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. The crimes of Charles Manson, Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, John Wayne Gacy, and other high-profile killers are so breathtakingly awful that most people would label them evil. Renowned psychiatrist Dr. Michael H. Stone, host of Discovery Channel's former series Most Evil, uses this as his starting point to explore the concept and reality of evil from a new perspective. Basing his analysis on the detailed biographies of more than 600 violent criminals, Dr. Stone has created a 22-level hierarchy of evil behavior, loosely reflecting the structure of Dante's Inferno. He traces two salient personality traits that run the gamut from those who commit crimes of passion to perpetrators of the worst crimes, sadistic torture and murder. One trait is narcissism, as exhibited in people who are so self-centered that they have little or no ability to care about their victims. The other is aggression, the use of power over another person to inflict humiliation, suffering, and death. What do psychology, psychiatry, and neuroscience tell us about the minds of those described as evil, and what will that mean for the rest of us? The book that we're discussing this evening is The Anatomy of Evil, with my special guest, journalist and author and professor, Dr. Michael H. Stone. Welcome to the program, and thank you for agreeing to this interview, Dr. Michael H. Stone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for agreeing to this interview. Now, Doctor, tell us a little bit about your background, and just briefly, and then tell us why you were compelled to, or why you were very interested in writing this book in particular and creating this hierarchy of evil, pardon me.
Well, I started out after I graduated psychiatry training at Columbia as a psychoanalyst, but then I had always been interested in personality disorders, which was one of the specialties of the unit that I was working on there. And
right.
Then I got into, after a while, the more darker and scary personality disorders. I started out with concentrating on borderline personality disorder, which is a kind of a combination of mood disorder and a lot of impulsivity and self-damaging acts, self-destructiveness. But then I would be hired to be an expert witness in cases where somebody was considered borderline or maybe antisocial or narcissistic or whatever. And then I got invited to be an expert witness in the murder case that involved Jeffrey McDonald, the Army Green Beret fellow in the late 70s that killed his pregnant wife and his two daughters. And I wanted to have some way of showing the jury out in California where that particular crime fit in what I call the grand scheme of man's inhumanity to man, which I subsequently shortened to just calling it evil. And so I began to say, well, it's a lot worse than Jean Harris when she killed the diet doctor, Herman Turnauer, who jilted her when she and he were having a love affair. That was a crime of passion. But it was not nearly as awful as what Ian Brady out in England was doing with his girlfriend Myra Hindley, who were luring young girls and boys to obscure places in the moors in England, strangling them, and then while Ian was strangling them, recording the screams on a tape recorder to use later as a kind of a sexual aphrodisiac between him and Myra. And I thought, well, that's about as low as it gets. So that was at that point, the opposite end of the scale. But I didn't divide it into so many fractions at that time because I was only just beginning to read, and those true crime books, of which I've now read even more than 600. So as time went on, I began to see if I could put them in different subgroups. In other words, were the men that killed their wives, were they of a different breed than the others? Were the guys that committed mass murder, like what we've seen lately last year with Jared Luckner in Arizona and James Holmes, and were they of a different personality stripe? Did they have different backgrounds? Were they mentally ill? Were they not mentally ill? And what about the serial killer? So I began then to make these partitions. That's how it got started.
Now, you go back in history because obviously we have a definition in our minds of what evil is now, but obviously people had a lot more religiosity confusing the definition or the issue itself. So tell us how far back you go in history and what you found about evil, and just tell us how the word evil has evolved over the centuries.
Yes, well, the first uses of it first of all, there was like the good and the bad. Even the people in Persia, the Zoroastrians in the 1000 BC, or some people think a little bit later, had the idea of a good god, and that was Ahura Mazda. By the way, when you turn on a light bulb, a Mazda light bulb, it's because the Mazda was the god of light. Anyway, and Ahriman, he was the bad god, the god of and just like God and Satan. So there was that idea of polarities between good and bad and evil got used together, often in a very similar way. However, the whole topic seemed to be something that was appropriate only to be out of the mouths of philosophers and religious adepts, as if they knew or about what evil was, and common people were not considered a reliable source of the definition. But as you know, and that went on century after century. I mean, St. Thomas had his views, and the great philosophers during the Enlightenment, they had their views. They used the word evil, but they used it in a rather vague way. They didn't get down to cases. You can read Kant, and you can read Hobbes, but you don't get down to individual persons who personify the concept they were talking about. So it's kind of an airy concept. But nevertheless, I noticed that people in everyday life use the word. Journalists use the word. Prosecutors use the word. Judges use the word. And they use it to describe, when you think about it, an emotion. It's an emotional word because when you hear about something that horrifies you, shocks you, it makes you sick even to hear about it, you have a tendency to say, oh, and there's a change in your facial expression. As a matter of fact, I was talking about that with a patient of mine today, and I mentioned this case of China Arnold, a woman who, when her new boyfriend objected to the mess and bother of the baby she had by a previous boyfriend, she said, she put it in a microwave. Now, he was just aghast at that. And, of course, the word evil came tumbling out of his mouth. He said, my God, what an evil thing to do. So I use that as my way of thinking about evil, because that gets down to earth in a very practical way, and it makes it easier for me to talk about it rather than getting all wound up in, if God is good, then how can he allow evil and all that sort of thing that the old philosophers tried to untangle.
So as part of still a throwback from the very beginning, really you have to include with your definition, any definition of evil is breathtakingly horrible and something that would shock a community, a degree of suffering. So, but really just something that would shock a community is the sort of something right from the very, very beginning was used at least ideally as a word for a definition for evil.
Yes, but the word evil, don't forget it, it comes from the Anglo-Saxon word Y-F-E-L, which happens to be pronounced evil the same way, and it's related to the German word über, which means above and over, and übel, bad, and so that it's a cousin word having to do with beyond, over the top. In other words, it's beyond. If you think about things which are socially acceptable or socially endurable, and then there are acts which are way beyond what the social contract permits, so that idea of over the top is embedded in the word evil. It's something excessive, way over what would be tolerable.
Yes, you say in the book that there's always has to be the element of excess and a deviation from standards and norms. So tell us the four issues that you have, or four distinctions that you have to truly, just first off, define evil.
Well,
I have it in front of me if you don't. So
okay. Of course, the idea of being horrifyingly awful, I think that was a key element. What were some of the things that you had?
Well, what was it that you put breathtakingly horrible as number one, and number two, you have malice afterthought, which is evil intention.
Yes.
Which usually would precede the act. And number three, you'd have the degree of suffering inflicted will be wildly, again, excessive. And four, the nature of the act will appear incomprehensible, bewildering, over and beyond the imagination of ordinary people in the community.
Yes. Well, I'll give you an example from just a couple of days ago. Another person I know sent me a copy of something from a Brazilian newspaper having to do with a dispute. The dispute is a very soft word to describe what happened in a soccer game. It was an amateur soccer game between a couple of teams up in Maranhão in the northern part of Brazil. So the referee tried to eject a particular player named Abreu from the game. I don't know for what reason exactly. And the guy got very angry at the referee, so the referee pulled out a knife and stabbed him, and the man died. And when the man died on the way to the hospital, the Abreu family stormed the field, and they captured this referee. It was a 20-year-old fellow. They beat him, they stoned him, they lynched him, they cut off his legs and arms, and then his head, and then and that was that. So that is first of all horrifying. As a matter of fact, I was speechless when I saw it. Usually I'm so used to hearing about these things, I have some kind of witty gallows humor thing to say, but this one just cut me short. You can even see the video of the poor guy on the gurney in the hospital. It's just awful. So that is, and it's breathtaking. You wonder how in God's name can a person do that to another. So it really fulfills all those criteria that you mentioned.
Mm-hmm. Do you think to a certain degree, this is a little off topic, but I just thought I have you here. Do you really think, or do you think that despite the media attention that some people claim that that's all it is there an escalation by killers? There seem to be some unofficial competition, but in terms of escalation or in terms of degree of severity, in terms of what we would call humiliation, now that with the ability with Facebook and some of these things, YouTube or whatever you're going to put yourself on these days to promote your psychopathic alter ego or your character or your crimes or the fame that you might derive from it. Do you think that there has been an escalation or there is an escalation in crime or the severity of crime?
Yeah, I do. As a matter of fact, I've been getting together a PowerPoint presentation, and I've been in touch with some TV producers in the last few weeks. And in order to show them what I had in mind, I made a PowerPoint presentation with about almost 60 slides, and what I called it the new evil, because I began to notice that the particularly gruesome crimes were occurring predominantly from the middle 1960s on. And there were now and then, occasionally, some pretty grim and gruesome crimes, of course, before. And mind you, we're always talking peacetime criminals, not wartime atrocities. For instance, in 1906, there's the famous so-called crime of the century case of Chester Gillette that got his girlfriend pregnant and didn't want to be responsible, so he offered her to take her for a ride in a boat in the lake up here in the Adirondacks, and then dumped her in the water and drowned her. And that was pretty awful, but it has nothing to do with decapitating her or gouging her eyes out or anything of that sort. So what you began to see in the 60s is much more gruesome crimes, and you saw mass murderers. There were always a few mass murderers, and I have a very large Excel file or spreadsheet of mass murderers, almost 300, starting from 1900, but from between 1900 and 1910, there's a couple examples, and then the next decade and so on. But once you get to the late 60s and 70s, it begins to take off at a greater rate than the American population increased. Serial killers, again, very, very rare. A few in the 19th century, a few like Albert Fish, they cannibalized and cut up a couple of children in the 20s. A few other people of that sort, but then it begins to spike in the 60s and it peaks in the 1980s. And now it's maybe even dropped off a bit. And it seems to be a response, in the case of serial killers, to among a number of social factors, the high divorce rate in the 60s in our country, the feminist movement that allowed a lot of women to leave and divorce from men that would be battering them, so that the kind of women that were stuck in the very uncomfortable home situations in the old days, now they could leave, but that meant that these rather violent and aggressive men lost their woman, and they weren't taking it lying down. So some of the serial killers, Gary Ridgway, for example, the Green River Killer, had a lot of vengeful attitudes toward women that they took out in these serial rape murders. And then this woman I just mentioned who stuck her own baby in a microwave, for God's sakes. I grew up, I never saw stuff like that when I was a kid, or even when I was in medical school. That's, to me, rather new. And, back in 87, there was this woman out in New Mexico that told her boyfriend, you got to marry me because, I'm pregnant and so on, but actually she was not. So as the time grew near, and he was like so many men, dumb enough not even to notice that her belly wasn't getting very big, or she'd even maybe put a little extra, maybe a sweater in there to make it look as though she was having a bit of a tummy. She went to a OBGYN clinic in Albuquerque, and she, at gunpoint, kidnapped a woman, 9 months pregnant woman, who was coming out of the clinic. She then took her in her car, drove her to a remote spot, and then proceeded to rip open her belly with a key and steal the fetus, and then present it to her boyfriend as though, see, here's the baby. That's it's extremely shocking, and there was never any crime like that before 1987, and since then there have been a dozen and a half, including Lisa Montgomery, that was a very high-profile case about 5 years ago in Missouri. So I think there's a course in the very first program I did was with Diane Fanning, and it was Baby Be Mine, and it was someone befriended someone through, social networking, and the unsuspecting mother-to-be was posting stuff about her birth, and this woman was pretending, always wanted to be pregnant, faked it with her family somehow or other, carved the baby lived. She foisted or tried to fool the family and that this and a husband and children that this was the baby, and succeeded for a few days. But and when you find out what's really odd is, again, you think that's incredible, but there's been a half dozen of them since then. So yes, So, as I said, to me that represents a kind of a coarsening and selfishness on a much more extreme plane than I was used to seeing in the crimes that I grew up with, where even the kidnappers would kidnap a kid, post a ransom amount, maybe the parents would then pay the ransom amount and get their kid back. Sometimes they didn't get their kid back, but it was not done in a way with the kind of brutality or the horror that we see now, like with this fellow Ariel Castro in Cleveland that kidnapped those 3 poor girls for 10 years, or Garrido that kept Chasey Dugard for 18 years and had 2 kids by her out in California.
Or you have the case that will come to trial next year in Montreal, Luca Manada.
Yes.
That's his new name. Murdering.
Wasn't even his own name, but anyway.
Live murder online, and then post it. And the other part of the phenomena is that I've never seen more response to anybody doing anything. He's got followers, some satanic followers, some just friends, some just want to have sex with him, but definitely a lot of followers. And incredible, I don't know how many people, but a credible amount of people watch that video. So it's a new way to humiliate. It's a new way to be, again, psychopathic and narcissistic, and again, inflict suffering. And so I think it's an escalation in terms of what these guys can do, and I think it's like anybody, like a musician now might go back 20 years, that some of these guys have been romanticized or just they're infamous. Bundy, Gacy, Dahmer, and so some people are influenced, and I've seen that personally myself, in that some of these guys really look up to them as sort of role models and want that kind of fame for themselves. Ramirez or some of these guys.
The idea of fame, like Andy Warhol saying we each get our 15 minutes of fame. Magnotta, well, that was not his original name, but the point is, he did something that I don't think anyone ever has done before, which is to mail some of the dismembered parts to officials in the Canadian government, for God's sakes. It's like if you were writing a novel, a pulp novel for money, and wanted to put a lot of gruesome things in it, I suspect you wouldn't be novelistic enough to make up some of the stuff that happens out there now on an almost weekly basis.
Yeah, it is amazing. Well, I'm glad you said that, because I've had so many answers from people to say, oh, no, the media is just reporting on it more. And I don't know where I've been all these years, but the media always report on it. In fact, they reported on it a lot more. I grew up with
no one hides murders. No one hides murders.
No.
They might hide purse snatching, but not murder. So.
Not every murder appeals and resonates, but some really do, and we could talk about that. It's another issue too. But certain murders, you could see them dominate television and conversation for a year or more. So incredible. Yeah. Now, getting back to this anatomy of evil, you have carefully put this into chapters that you talk about evil in peacetime, because And why is there a distinction, or why do you make the distinction, and why do you feel it's important to this system that you've come, this system of gradation, the evil in peacetime as opposed to, say, evil in wartime?
Well, in wartime, very ordinary people can be conscripted into an army or some group that is quite capable of committing horrifying atrocities, who nevertheless are not of that particular bent during their pre-war or after-war behavior. So that, for instance, during World War II, the Nazis would have special so-called Einsatzgruppen, or the attack groups, who would go into Polish towns and round up the Jews and make them dig graves where they would then be machine gunned, and ordinary soldiers, if they happen to be part of that regiment or whatever, would be told, well, here's your rifle and mow these Jews down. You had even the permission to say, Captain, I don't know that I'm up for it, and then they would let you go. But of course, a lot of them, there were very few that opted out, most of them were perfectly willing to do it because they had been so bombarded with prejudice and the words of the Führer and so on, that they're so whipped up with enthusiasm, for how these are like vermin that need to be wiped out, that they could go ahead and do it, and then go back to their girlfriends or wives or whatever, or certainly after the war, and lead very ordinary lives. So they were not arch criminals, except for the top people. They were all ordinary folk, the same as happened in many wars, and many even gang fights, like between the Crips and the Bloods out in L.A. So I wanted to focus on people that were warped in some way in personality and perhaps even mentally, who in peacetime, without any provocation or without being whipped up by some leader to fight some named enemy, were quite capable of committing atrocities. So it's a different group of people.
Yeah, I find that interesting, but I think you could have a debate just on that one, and I won't create the debate, but the over and beyond. Again, you talked about conscripted soldiers doing what they were told. However, the Nazis themselves, or the Gestapo, or certain people around Hitler, let's put it that way, were again probably the epitome of evil, regardless of wartime or peacetime. But again, we could go on that one, on that debate for sure.
Yeah, the higher up they were, the more you're correct. But even I was on the other example I was thinking of, the people who react to an atrocity. For instance, during the Napoleonic Wars in the early 19th century, in 1807 or 8, they invaded Spain, and the soldiers did horrible things to the Spanish people. And some of the Spanish people would then band together and round up and take a Napoleonic soldier and press him between two boards and put weights on top and crush. In other words, they would commit atrocities to the soldiers. So that the rage and the outrage of being the victims of atrocity would turn many of the populace into doing equally unspeakable things to their oppressors. And these were not necessarily criminal types. Yeah.
Yeah, and for the purpose of what you're doing, too, you have to really, it's a Herculean task what you're trying to do, too, because you not only do you're creating this scale, this hierarchy of evil, you have to really look at almost every, again, 600 cases or more in all the books that you've read, like you say, to be able to say, okay, this is absolutely not evil, and then this is absolutely evil, and then, of course, what are the numbers in between. You go through crimes of impulse and jealousy and rage. Then you go to antisocial persons. Tell us about crimes of impulse and jealousy and rage, and why some of those can be classified as evil and why some of those can't.
Well, again, if they have that horror element, then people will tend to speak of them as evil acts. But the crimes of passion will elicit that to a lesser degree, or people, even if they say, well, it was an evil thing for Jean Harris to shoot her lover, even though you can sort of understand it, the reaction is less strong than somebody else who especially forms a pathological jealousy. In other words, jealousy in response to a spouse or a lover that didn't even cheat on them, but where the person imagined that the lover, well, for example, there was a man recently who thought that his wife was cheating on him. She was not, but he was so enraged that he threw acid in her face and disfigured her for life. And I have these horrible pictures of that person. So I think anyone looking at the poor woman's face, who was just grossly disfigured because of the acid bath that he hurled in her direction, would say that that was a terrible, evil thing, or because they would feel compassion and sympathy with the poor, suffering wife. And he was, of course, put in prison for life and so on. and had even a twinge of remorse. Because he had known that he had done a terrible thing, but that was a jealousy that was going way beyond the ordinary man. That the Raging Bull, that movie where the boxer would maybe assault his wife because his brother would give her a kiss on the cheek when they came over for dinner, and he would think, oh, that's because she wanted him to. That kind of pathological jealousy is pretty awful also, but he stopped short of killing the poor woman. But throwing acid in the face of somebody, which, by the way, is a rather common way in some of the Islamic countries, especially Persia or Pakistan, for dealing with women that annoy you. You know, the wife cheats, or you think she cheats, or whatever. They will, or if a woman that you're trying to get engaged to and she rejects you, there have been a lot of cases where the man will disfigure her by putting lye or acid in her face. And to me, those are really dreadful acts of evil.
Yeah. Now, tell us, Dr. Stone, what exactly, and give us a case example. Again, we've already mentioned it, but tell us an example of the lowest scale, a case study, an example of the lowest grade on the evil scale, and then after that, tell us about someone that's the highest. And again, we've already mentioned that, but tell us about that, and then we'll go through. We'll try to go from the scale from say the top down, and then you can describe why these are different. Again, grades of evil, you're assigning different numbers or levels to these levels of evil itself. So let's start with the least evil and on your scale, and why you have made why you believe it's this lowest on the scale of evil.
Well, the ones who are very low, of course, we already mentioned Jean Harris, right. And because it was a crime of passion when she discovered another woman's panties in the drawer next to hers in Herman Tarnauer's bedroom or whatever. So she became very depressed and just like her felt her whole life was crushed, and so she got a gun and she killed him. So that's because it's a crime of passion. In some countries, I think there are times when in France that would almost be let go. I mean, I think there are some women who have killed husbands in that way. It's considered, it's a bad thing to do. It wasn't right, but it's so. The average person can picture doing something. You can have a fantasy. If you suddenly found your wife in bed with somebody else, and Jesus Christ, and said you want to kill either her or the SOB that was doing it. It's such a natural feeling that comes into us that we might, in some cases, of course, lose our impulse control and do something very violent. But it's more understandable, so that although it's recognized as a kind of evil that's really nickel and dime, it's just the lowest of the evil acts. There's a dancer, Kathy Woods, that a fellow by the name of Paul Cortez was fond of, and when she rejected him, he stabbed her. So that was another crime of passion. Another number, and I use the number 2 as the lowest of my scale for evil, because the ones I purposely use as justified homicide or self-defense homicide, just to anchor the scale, so that there's a division between a killing, homicide that's not evil, that's number 1, versus the 2 up to 22, where the word evil has been applied by some of the people who were aware of the crime.
Okay. So go ahead with. We'll go from the bottom, then we'll proceed up rather than from top down. You talk about self-defense. You talk about homicide, self-defense being number 1 in that distinction. Take us to number 2 and 3, please.
Well, 2, we already said something about
right.
that. As a matter of fact, 3 there was a Cindy Campbell. She had a boyfriend, and as far as she told the boyfriend anyway, the father had an incestuous relationship with her. So she became very angry and incensed, and I probably whipped him into a state of mind where they went ahead and killed not only the father that she said was molesting her sexually, but also the mother. So that was a more unjustified, if you will, example of a murder. It was not a crime of passion as though the husband, boyfriend, whatever, had rejected her, but rather she was responding to the fact that she had, she said she was an incest victim, so that's more indirect than your own lover jilting you, etc. So I think that was why I decided to give her a somewhat higher number.
And she killed her mother.
Yes.
Did she? Unless she blamed her mother for the incestuous.
Well, it's hard to know why. Maybe just because they felt that they had to kill both. Either to get away with it, or just to, in a way, maybe even to spare the mother the loss of her husband, if I can put it that way.
That's nice.
It's not so clear in that particular case why they killed both. But of course, the Menendez brothers killed both their parents. When the one that they were angry at was more the father, for being very critical of Eric and Lyle, for being sloughing off their work at school and being failures. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I guess I watched that. I don't know too many people had too much sympathy for the Menendez brothers, really. But so that's number 4.
Yes, here now I'm looking at the 4s and 5s. One of the if I can get a slideshow out of it. Here we go. I'm just number 5. I put down traumatized, desperate persons who have killed abusing relatives, but who lack significant psychopathic traits. In other words, they're not totally callous and remorseless and narcissistic, etc. They've just been treated very cruelly, and they're kind of getting back at the people that hurt them. You may be familiar with the Velma Barfield in North Carolina had a violent father, and she was also an incest victim, but she was actually she was treated better by virtue of being a sexual object by her father than some of the other siblings. But when her when her life began to go downhill after she lost her husband, she then poisoned her mother and other relatives to collect insurance money to pay for her drug habit. So that was a more serious kind of act, and I put that in number 5. The same as I did Mary Bell, who was tortured by her prostitute mother in the north of England, and then killed 2 children, but was actually able to be rehabilitated morally and spiritually as she got older.
Yeah, I'd heard about that. I think I watched that on Investigation Discovery, possibly. So.
Mm-hmm.
Now, why make that distinction? Why is Mary Bell not higher up in terms of evil? Just from your basic description.
She was only 11 years old when she committed the murder of the 2 boys, so that she was not acting like an adult with more full awareness of consequences and so on. We tend not to be as harsh with children who kill as we do with adults. Besides which, one has great sympathy for the horrors to which she was subjected. Don't forget, her mother tried to kill her in a number of ways, and then also would invite her Johns, her men that she would be prostituting over, and sometimes they would use Mary when she was 5 or 6 years old as a sexual object and put sticks in her vagina. Well, hell, you have to have some sympathy for a girl that's been violated in that way. But the main thing is that after she was in reformatories and even prison, for quite a number of years, like 10, 11 years, she experienced remorse. She showed herself having the capacity, to be a good person. She had a moral sense, and she was released in England, of course, under a false name, and she did marry and have a kid.
There you go. Okay, now continue with number 7 for us.
Well, 7, I used this fellow Prosenjit Poddar. He was the one who came from India. He was from the lowest caste over there, but very bright persons. He was from the so-called Harijan or the low caste people. And nevertheless, he became an engineering student, as I recall. And in his culture, if you gave a girl a gift and she accepted the gift, that meant you were engaged. Well, there was a pretty girl, Tatiana Tarasov, over there in California, University of California, Berkeley, and he left her a kind of a scarf, I think it was. He had a casual meeting with her at probably some school dance or whatever, and she picked it up, and he was spying on this from across the street, I guess, and she looked at it and wondered what the heck it was and dumped it. So that meant that she spurned his engagement. Well, he became very depressed and also very angry, and he was telling his psychiatrist about that, and the psychiatrist was like dutifully taking notes, and and he was saying, "I'm going to kill that bitch," whatever. And the psychiatrist did not do anything, did not warn Tatiana that she was in imminent risk of being hurt. So he did kill her, and then that gave rise, of course, the family sued, and that gave rise to the famous Tarasov decision that if you're a psychiatrist like I am, and I've had it happen 3 times in my career, that if you are in a situation where you have heard pretty convincing evidence from a patient that they mean to kill or hurt another person, you must warn that person. Or if they say, "I'm going to get a gun and I'm going to kill whoever is out the window," then you have to notify the police, because there's no named victim. There's just strangers. And most states have the Tarasov law. But I spoke about Poddar as a highly narcissistic, but not totally psychopathic person. In other words, he was not like a con artist or anything of that sort. But he killed a loved one out of jealousy, but where the loved one was somebody that was almost like an imaginary loved one, because he barely knew her.
Right. Okay, now continue with number 8 for us, please.
Well, 8, I put Charles Whitman. He's the famous Texas Tower killer in I think 1966, and he was the one. Now, he had a tough background. His father was very abusive, but he came from an otherwise economically all right family. And he was a Marine, and he'd been a pretty good soldier. But life began to spiral down for him, and there came a point where he killed his wife and his mother, and then ascended the tower, as we all know, and shot and killed 16 people. That's including the wife and mother, before the SWAT team killed him. Interesting thing about Whitman was, of course, that when he was autopsied, he had a brain tumor which may have pressed on the frontal lobes in such a way as to make his impulse control weaker than it would be had he not had that tumor. So the tumor was a factor. But he was himself a person with smoldering rage, but he was not a psychopath, really. He was not somebody who had that combination of extreme narcissistic traits that come under the heading of psychopathy, such as glib speech and superficial charm and manipulativeness and grandiosity and callousness, most particularly, and lack of remorse. and exploitativeness. He didn't have those qualities. He was a better person than that, but he was a very rageful person, and unfortunately, I guess the tumor caused him to flip and lose the ability to control his rageful impulses, which he might have been able to control if that had not been a factor.
Now, you talk about psychopathic tendencies and traits, and in your chapters you have antisocial persons, and then the next chapter, chapter 4, you have murder on purpose, the psychopathic schemers, and then in chapter 6 you have the psychopath at work. How important, and what number do you begin to include psychopathic personality and personality traits in terms of the scale of evil? At what point, at what number do you start including psychopathic killers?
Around 9, because the human mind is so complex. There are some people with, let's say, a few psychopathic traits, but not the full picture, who nevertheless do something very dastardly, and other people with a lot of psychopathic traits that do something that's not quite so shocking. So there's a little gray area around 9 and 10. But my 9, the more typical one, is this fellow Ira Einhorn down in Philadelphia, who was manic depressive, really. He was a manic-y guy, charismatic. He was very irritable. He was the hippie guru that was a counterculture person who was getting on his megaphone out in public and arguing against the Vietnam War. But he had a very beautiful girlfriend, Holly Maddox, and he was very possessive, and to the point of kind of just crushing her spirit. So finally she said, basta, enough already, and she left. I think she came to New York. And then he lured her back out of, again, jealousy and anger, back to Philadelphia, where he then killed her, and he put her in a steamer trunk and kept her body in a steamer trunk in his closet. And I think it was 2 years before it was discovered, because by that time the poor soul, her flesh had melted into fatty adipose tissue and was, I think, dripping down in the neighbor's apartment below. So he then fled to Europe. He was championed by some wealthy people in this country, and he married somebody, I think, a Swedish woman. They lived in the south of France, and it took a long time before he was found out. And then the French people were reluctant to extradite him back here, lest we give him the death penalty, so we had to promise, no, we won't give him the death penalty. And now he is in prison in Pennsylvania. I was supposed to speak to him. He was reluctant to speak to me, so that never quite came off in the Most Evil program. But that's he'd also, by the way, been very aggressive and damaging and injurious to a number of previous girlfriends, so that he was a continuously violent man, and therefore it was different from just an ordinary jealousy case. He had many psychopathic features, so I put him higher up in number 9.
Now, just before we get too far up here, too, because this is always, I think, it comes up anyway quite a bit. Regarding mental illness, how much credit do you assign a case where you have elements of mental illness, either pre-diagnosed or diagnosed after the fact, but at least in your mind, clear elements of mental illness? How much do you use this in terms of to lower the number on the scale of evil? How much do you consider that in regards to mental illness?
I do consider it, and sometimes I find it confusing, and I'm not always sure I come up with the best solution. For instance, in the higher numbers, I know if the person is distinctly schizophrenic, I will knock it down to a special category, one less than what the person might otherwise be placed if he were not psychotic. But then there are other ones where I'll try to handle it by, let's say, instead of saying this is a case 13, I'll make it 13A, where it's the same like 13, only the person is mentally ill, where I draw attention to the fact that there's a mitigating circumstance that would tend to lower the nature of evil, because if a person, like poor Andrea Yates, for example, who drowned her 5 children, she was grossly psychotic. She was you probably are aware, a valedictorian of her high school and a good person, a very depressed person, and a lot of the relatives in her family were also depressed. And this husband of hers, that most of my colleagues and I would have felt was the more responsible party in many ways, forced the poor woman to live in this little hollowed-out bus that he made, like a Greyhound bus that was emptied of the seats and turned into a mobile home. And she had to homeschool and home church the 5 children, the oldest of which was only 7, and it was way more than her capacity to be a mother and so on could handle. So she just, as they say, lost it and drowned the 5 children. So she was mentally ill, and I can't remember where I put her in the scale or if I even bothered, but she's an example of somebody who had the mitigating circumstances of doing an evil act, certainly, and the whole country was electrified by it, but was not a flat-out evil person like Ted Bundy or somebody.
Right. Okay, now continue up to. Let's skip ahead a little bit because we might not get through to this. Let's get up into the higher levels of evil, maybe say 17 or 18. Let's get up into there and then talk about a case study or one of your subjects and describe why they are so much higher than where we left off here at number 9.
Mm-hmm. Just trying to think whether you want to even do let's say, a 16.
Sure.
I think there's a fellow in Japan, Miyazaki Tsutomu, who came from a very wealthy family. His father ran a newspaper. He was born into a wealthy family, and he had a congenital hand defect such that he was not able to hold his hands palm up. And you may think, well, so what? But I've been to Japan enough times to know that that's a pretty awful thing for a kid to have, because when people come over, they give, in order to give thanks, you have to use those muscles, and people put little things in your outstretched palm, etc., as a gift. And so it's very embarrassing and humiliating if you can't do that. So he became very shy, very much a loner, and he did spend all his time in a room in the big house looking at comics and CDs and so on. But he couldn't establish intimacy with like women his age. So he would lurk around young girls. He became a stalker. And then in around 89, he kidnapped and murdered several young girls, and he mutilated their body and mailed their severed hands to the parents. Well, I mean, wow. Imagine opening a box and there's your daughter's hand, for God's sake. So so he committed multiple vicious acts, a kind of a serial killer in a way. I guess he really was. But again, he was not a psychopath pure and simple so much as a very disturbed schizoid, in other words, a loner, aloof person that couldn't interact with others, who did these terrible things that would shock the poor parents of their missing daughters. So I considered him a schizoid, partly a psychopathic person. He didn't commit other crimes the way so many for instance, Ted Bundy committed a lot of juvenile delinquency acts when he was in his teens, but Miyazaki didn't do that, so that it was more the callousness, the unfeelingness that he could do such a thing to a poor child, and then horrify the parents by mailing their hands to the parents.
Why would you, not to get hung up on this, but why would you think that showed an element of more schizophrenia versus psychopathology in terms of sending the hands to the parents? The story of
Miyazaki. I remember reading books about him. I was studying Japanese at the time, and my Japanese teacher and I would go over the story, and it was more the story of this pathetic loner that just couldn't make contact with anyone, but who, in other respects, until he began to do those terrible things, had not had a bad or aggressive history. In other words, he spent time just as an isolate in his room reading comics and whatever, but he'd never stolen anything. He never robbed anybody. He had a clean record up to the time that he began luring those children. I think one could argue, well, why isn't he 17? Maybe one can make an argument for that, but for reasons that seem fairly convincing to me at the time, I put him one little notch lower.
Right. Now, who is a notch above him then?
Well, of course, Bundy. Bundy's. I put Bundy at 17 originally. So I subsequently learned that he did, toward the end of his career, excuse me, bite into and do some pretty torturous things to some of those women, so that he might belong higher. I felt from the original things I read about him that he did not do that, except maybe at the very end where he did bite a young girl and was actually identified by the dental impressions in her arm. But he was this illegitimate child, and there's even the possibility, it's never been, I think, confirmed or totally disproven, that his grandfather may have also been his father. But that man was violent in any case, and the mother moved from Vermont, I think it was, to Washington State, in Seattle, I guess, and married this fellow, John Bundy. Tacoma, actually, was where they moved. And he was often bullied when he was young. He was shy, but he did engage in like peeping Tomism. He may have hurt or even dispatched a little 8-year-old girl when he was 14. But he could be, as we all know, charming and sociable, which is the more classical psychopathic qualities. He had that grin and the smile, and he could be very charming in an outward way to people. He actually, as you know, worked on a suicide prevention radio program with Ann Rule, the famous true crime writer.
Right.
So,
yeah, fooled her, detective, yeah.
Yeah, and then he had his first love, a woman from a higher social class, which was something very important to him to kind of move up socially. But this girl, Stephanie Brooks, rejected him, and that was when he began luring and raping and killing at least 24 girls en route from Washington to Florida. And he also engaged in having sex with the corpses, necrophilia. He escaped from prison in Colorado, and finally was apprehended from the bite marks, as I mentioned, back in 1978. Now, he had gone to law school, although he dropped out, but, of course, he tried to extend his life by saying, if you let me live a little bit longer, I'll show you some more bodies, some more places where I dumped the bodies. But they said enough already, and he was executed, as you know, in 1989. But nevertheless, some judge, and I'm glad I don't know his name because I would feel like hitting him, allowed him to marry in prison and have conjugal visits, so he's the father of some son out there somewhere.
Yeah,
which I think is ridiculous.
Yeah, I think so too. Now, there are more evil people than Ted Bundy, so tell us, as we go up this scale, who has made it to number 18?
Well, the 18, where this, I consider that the group where torture happened, but the murder was the primary motive, usually to avoid detection. But the torture was not prolonged and not methodical. For instance, this fellow Jerry Brudos was born back in 1939, a long time ago, and they moved to Oregon when he was a kid, and he became fascinated with high-heeled shoes, and the way kids will do, he wore them sometimes, his mom's shoes, but he was roundly scolded by his mother as though that was being a pansy or whatever. So she humiliated him, for doing that. Whereas I think most boys at one point will try to see what it's like when they're 5 years old, to walk around in high heels and see what that's like. So he developed a shoe fetish when he was by 10 already, and which also extended to women's underwear. So eventually he would follow and stalk women, especially if they had pretty shoes and whatever, and he would break into a woman's house to steal the shoes. He might rape her. That was in his late 20s. Then he murdered someone and kept the woman's foot in the freezer as a fetishistic object. Then he raped half a dozen more women in the early 70s or late 60s. His wife divorced him meantime after he was arrested. And there's that typical psychopathic lack of remorse. Well, a reporter once asked him, said, Jerry, now that you've been in prison a while and you've had the chance to look back on your life, do you feel anything about what you did in those women? And he rolled up a little piece of paper into a paper wad, which he flicked onto the floor. And he said, I feel as much for those women as I do for that wad of paper. So that extreme contempt was something that was characteristic of Jerry, but the level of torture was modest, if one can speak of modest in respect to torture, in comparison to some of the worst people. So I left him at 18.
Okay, let's just go to number 22. We'll leave a couple out for our audience to read on their own, discover on their own. But who has topped the scale at number 22, and describe that case for us?
Of course, I mentioned Brady already, Ian Brady in England. He's, by the way, still alive and, as you know, trying to die by not eating, so they stick this tube down him and feed him that way. Although sometimes he does sneak a piece of toast. I'm friends with one of the forensic psychiatrists, Jeremy Cohen, a very fine London-based psychiatrist who knows Ian Brady and says that Ian Brady is the most narcissistic person he's ever confronted in his whole life.
Sure.
So another one that I put at 22 was this fellow Andrei Chikatilo in Ukraine, who really began killing and raping and cannibalizing in his early 40s already, mostly girls, some boys, and a few adults. But he would bite off their lips, he would bite off their sexual organs, he would eviscerate his victims, he would eat uteruses and things of that sort. Now, he has suffered a measure of humiliation when he was young. He was very shy, he seemed to be sexually inadequate, although he did have a wife and children. But he was a friendless loner sort of a person, and then he developed this terrible paraphilia of raping and killing and eviscerating and actually eating some of the parts of his victims. So he was captured about 13 years ago and executed back in 94. Was there also, I know he made a spectacle of himself in court, and there was a whole issue of restraining him. And if there was ever a person that looked like a psychopathic madman, it was him in that, yes, it was
trial.
Chikatilo. Yeah.
Was there contact also with the victims' families of? Because that's another feature that's especially evil. Was there anything like?
I don't think so. Yeah, I think he lured people. One of the more high-profile ones in our country, of course, is Leonard Lake out in California, who teamed up with this fellow Charles Manson from, I think, Hong Kong originally, and he had built a torture kind of a home or anyway in a remote place in California, and would lure people, sometimes whole couples or couples with a kid. His main victims were women, but he did kill a number of their husbands or boyfriends too, using Eng as his accomplice. And he would tie up his victims. And for instance, let's say a woman was tied up and she would be begging for, let me see my baby. And he said, you'll see your baby when we let you out, but it had already killed the baby. And he would tell the woman, who was being tied up in a chair and beaten, so that you're our sexual slave, we're the masters, and we can screw you when we want, we can hit you when we want, so that the master-slave mentality that Roy Hazelwood from the FBI writes about, that was very much the type of murderer that Leonard Lake was. However, when he was apprehended for, I think, a parking ticket, he thought maybe, wow, they have the goods on me, and he committed suicide with a cyanide tablet in his mouth. And Charles he fled to Canada, and it took years for them to extradite him back, again for the same reason they had to promise in California not to execute him, and it cost millions and millions of dollars, all the legal wrangling to get Eng back in San Quentin, where he still is. I have some friends who are psychologists who work in San Quentin, so I get the news from some of these people periodically.
Yeah, it was one of the first cases that I had. I had the excellent true crime author Don Lasseter on, and he wrote the book about Leonard Lake, Charles Eng, and just incredible. Yeah, incredible story. And then the other story that you mentioned as well is the David Parker Ray case. Yes. Talk about torture and evil. He's right up there. So. Yes,
I mean, yeah. By the way, we shouldn't ignore the fact that occasionally there will be a woman, very rare. The psychopaths outnumber the men outnumber the women by about 8 to 1. There's very, very few women who indulge in this kind of torture the way men do. But Teresa Knorr, that I think was talked about in the Most Evil program, but they don't allow you in California to actually go out and interview them with video. So she's in Chowchilla prison, but she's the one that tortured her daughters and killed 2 of them in the most unspeakable ways. I mean, she actually had her son, after torturing one of the daughters, take her out to a remote place in the San Francisco Bay Area and pour accelerant over her and burn her to death alive, and so that her body was not recognized for a long time. And when one of the surviving daughter that tried to run into the police and say what happened, the police didn't believe her. Said, what mother would do that?
This mother, incredible. Now, what did you learn from this, trying to come up with a system of hierarchy of evil that you just could not imagine that you would have learned during this process? Was there anything that really surprised you, or anything that you really profound that you learned in this entire process?
Yes, there were several things. I think, first of all, about the serial killers, so many of them came from very terrible backgrounds that you would say, oh, well, if you're beaten or your parents humiliated you or threatened you with a knife, so you got to expect that the person might turn out bad. But what's fascinating is that there's a small number of the serial killers, including, in a way, Bundy himself, who did not experience, from the parents, humiliation, neglect, beatings, nothing. He didn't fall on his head. The head injury is a factor in a number of these men. So when nothing of the usual environmental stresses is present in a particular case, you have to think about something genetic, or something constitutional. And then constitutional would mean what happened during the 9 months of pregnancy. Did the mother abuse drugs? Was the birth process difficult? Was the baby kind of blue and had a low oxygenation when it came out? But what's the most interesting are the ones where there isn't even that factor, and so you have to think about the possibilities, and since personality is half under genetic control, that some of these people are really like the traditional idea of bad seed, that they're born with a predisposition to be low in empathy, so much so that they're capable of doing terrible things that you and I would consider terrible, that they have no more feeling about than as if they were whittling a piece of wood.
So what could you conclude from that? Because you do have a chapter about science and what neuroscience is concluded, and again, there's not major conclusions, but what could you say then? If it looks like there's the bad seed, is that what you conclude, that there are bad seeds, or what did you find in your study here scientifically that could contribute to this?
Well, the fact that there were some people who exemplify the old concept of bad seed. Now, since I don't do magnetic resonance imaging, that's for the neuroscientific group in my field. There are people, however, like Adrian Raine, who's a very gifted British psychiatrist who now is in Pennsylvania. He was in San Diego for a number of years. Now he's in Pennsylvania. And he's done very major work in magnetic resonance imaging of criminals, both antisocial men who don't have all the psychopathic features, the kind of men that get involved in barroom brawls or batter their wives or cheat on their child support or whatever, who are antisocial but not necessarily psychopathic. And then that, if you think of a prison having a certain population, about many of the men are antisocial, but only a fourth of them also meet criteria for psychopathy with the callousness and remorse and grandiosity and super narcissism and all the rest of it. But Adrian has shown that some of the hot-headed, the barroom brawl type, I use that as an example, they have certain areas that light up in their brain when you give them certain tests under the influence of magnetic resonance imaging, and they are hot-headed. Their emotionality shows up in various places in the brain in a particular way. If you look at the cold psychopath, however, they're different. They are not full of emotion and rage often when they do their killing. They're methodical about it the same way that you might be if you were a hunter trying to go out in the fields and kill deer for supper. So they're of a different brain change stripe than the antisocial men, and that's very interesting. So that, and of course, in all of these people, there's certainly some changes usually in the part of the frontal lobe that mediates emotion and social planning and making right decisions that makes us human as opposed to just like the ordinary animals, and that there's deficits in some of the key areas in the frontal lobes and also in the more primitive so-called limbic system underneath that cause the person to have poor control over impulses that an ordinary socialized person is able to control, so that things that you and I would maybe think of doing if we're jilted or fired from a job or whatever, or if our car is upended by some road rage guy, we think of maybe momentarily, I'm going to kill that SOB, but we don't.
Yeah.
But these people do. So Adrian has done a lot of important work in that area.
You really assert that maybe someday that we'll be able to use this sort of system, or we will be able to predict in a certain way and then maybe even steer these people away from criminality. Or is this really just a lofty goal, or do you really think there is some evidence of at least being able to identify, ideally,
I think we may be able to identify. Yeah, I think it's a very important point you make. I think we can begin to identify some youngsters, especially the people who've been given the name, and I'm talking about adolescents now, the callous-unemotional youth. The callous, unemotional youth. Because if you follow the callous, unemotional youth up into his late teens and early 20s, you then often find that they have now turned into psychopaths. In other words, the callous, unemotional youth, is usually male, are psychopaths in embryo, if you will. They're going to evolve as psychopaths. When I was doing my program, actually, the woman down in Texas phoned me because she was very worried about her son. Interesting thing was, she had this son by a guy that she was having an affair with in another southern state before she left him and moved to Texas. She found out after a while that the man that she was living with, and who was the biological father of her boy, was an ex-con, and so that she felt this is not a marriage made in heaven or even an affair made in heaven, so she left. And she went to Texas and married a nice man and had a daughter by the husband. But the boy, meantime, became unmanageable. He would steal things from the father, and he would set fires in the house all over the place so that they had a fire extinguisher in every room. He also tortured animals. He would kill cats in a terrible way and other animals. He would bully kids in school, and he tried to strangle his sister. So she was wondering what in the heck to do with him. And I have some colleagues down in the Houston area that I talked to about this case. I said, he's been evaluated by a psychologist or a psychiatrist down there that doesn't seem to quite grasp the nature of the situation. Can't we get him into a kind of a reformatory or some kind of institution where he can be kept, looked at, studied, treated to what extent he can be treated, but at least rescued, airlifted out of that family so the family can continue as a unit, because he was really tearing apart the family. They couldn't live knowing that they had to be biting their fingernails every minute, wondering whether he's going to kill their daughter. So that happened. He went to an institution and he stayed there quite a bit of time. I remember speaking with them about this callous, unemotional youth. Now he's a bit older already, and he has some of the psychopathic features. They were able, I think he's in somewhat better control now, is my impression, than he was back then. So maybe they were able to, if not rehabilitate him to becoming a really person with ordinary emotional sentiments, at least to be able to control his violent impulses. So I think there's some ray of hope that at least a percentage of callous, unemotional youths can be identified by the nature of what they've done in their 12, 13, 14, 15 years. And some of them can be treated in such a way that the tendency to do terrible things can be minimized. I don't think one can, quotes, cure all of them. I think some of them are going to remain beyond successful treatment and always be worrisome. Some of them, now we don't have protective detention in our country where you could keep them forever before they've done a really serious murder. Definitely. But so we're not Russia, but at least we would have our eye on them, so to speak, and that might be helpful.
Mm-hmm. Now, we just have a little bit of time. I wanted to ask, this book has been out for a little bit of time. I'm not sure how long, but I know that you've done numerous interviews and been very well accepted. Tell us about the acceptance of the, how, if it's really caught on, or are you happy and content with the way it's been received in terms of this gradation of evil, this 22 level hierarchy of evil? Do you think people understand it that you've done the interviews with, and has it been accepted by your colleagues? Tell us about this acceptance of this scale of evil.
It's been accepted by a fair number of colleagues, and it's used. I know my colleagues in Sweden use it, and when I'm interviewed for television programs, the people who interview me have become familiar with it and are comfortable with it, etc. I'm supposed to be doing a show for Investigative Discovery this coming this coming Saturday about another dreadful man who killed his wife in an awful way, Richard Sharp, the doctor. So, and I'm also trying to get another, like a sequel to The Most Evil going, which I'm going to call The New Evil, because it's focusing on the kind of things you and I were talking about in the beginning, about the coarsening in the culture that has led to a lot of increasingly gruesome crimes in the recent years. And some, I think the people in my field, my colleagues, especially my forensic colleagues, are more comfortable with the use of the term evil, as I explained it, as an emotional word, not as a pronouncement from on high, etc. so that it has some currency there, although the publishing house Prometheus, it was not like publishing of a Doubleday or something, so that the total sales was rather short of what I might have hoped. But those that have read it and reviewed it have been, I would say, for absolutely the most part, quite enthusiastic about it.
So you're pretty happy with the results overall in terms of at least acceptance. No one's really got any major arguments with you on the distinctions that you have made and the way you've picked, what the criteria you've used to enable to have this evil.
That's right. As a matter of fact, they've in Most Evil, the program has been translated into Spanish, to many languages. When I was in Russia a couple of years ago, they were showing it at that time just by coincidence, and so many people, they knew who I was. They recognized me in the street. In South America and Mexico and Central America, because Spanish is a extremely widely spoken language, I gave a lecture down there about 3 weeks ago in Ciudad Juarez on the other side of El Paso, and they're very enthusiastic. I get lots and lots of Facebook and email comments from people in Brazil, and luckily I read Portuguese and Spanish and German and Russian and those languages, so at least I know what they're talking about, and I answer them as best I can. But I had a few what I call Lindsay Lohan moments when I was in another very famous person. I had a few moments of feeling like a celebrity down in Mexico because many people wanted to have their picture taken with me, which was not something I'm used to. So that I felt that I was having the kind of life that Lindsay Lohan was having without even having to get drunk.
Yeah. It's amazing though. This audience, this program has a big audience in Australia, and I hear from a lot of people from the UK and of course America and Canada and other countries as well. But there's a lot of people in Australia who listen to the program, and so I know that there's a lot of countries. I know a lot of places. Canada just kind of is the same thing. We don't know much about our own true crimes, except as of the last few years where we've had some guys that have really, really, really been competitive. But overall, we don't really know that much, and I think countries outside of America look to America for true crime. It's not like they're the only country that has these crimes, but America has done a good job of not shying away from them and basically regard them as history, and nobody winces, and eventually any program, any murder case, murder trial, whether it's gruesome or not, eventually reaches the public, who is a demanding public, a discerning public, and an interested public in these kinds of cases. And even the like you say, the analysis that you do is much different than a true crime book, which is, for the most part, fairly formulaic. And then when you do these analysis that some people might think that on the surface might be dry, there's a huge audience for the psychology of these killers. Of course, they read the true crime books, they love them, but they want to know why, and that's exactly the word.
In other words, the true crime books focus on, for the most part, who, what, where, when, how, and my focus is on why, and that's what makes the difference. And I have many colleagues in Australia too who I met some just in San Francisco at the meeting in May, and we talked about those things, and so that I know that it's shown there, as it is in all kinds of places, even places, rather obscure places like Malaysia. So,
no, it's a very, very interesting subject, and you have done a great job with this book, Dr. Stone, with The Anatomy of Evil, and I want to thank you very much for coming on the program and sharing the book and the journey into this Anatomy of Evil. I want to thank you very much for this.
Well, I want to thank you for having me on the program and giving me so much time. It's been a pleasure on my side, too. So.
Yeah, it's been very good. And for those that might want to contact you or find a copy of the book, obviously it's Amazon, Barnes & Noble, chapters in Canada, but is there any way that you encourage people to contact you, ask any questions, or to Facebook, or tell us how the best to contact you.
I like Facebook. It's a little complicated for me, and in some ways less private. So I prefer people to get in touch with me with my. I have several emails, but one of them is I use more often, which is mhstonemd@yahoo.com.
Well, that's good. I'm sure people will respond to this. We've got a very, very dedicated audience and very discerning and very attentive. So, and I'm sure they will appreciate this interview that we had this evening. So I want to thank you very much. You've been listening to Anatomy of Evil with my special guest, Dr. Michael H. Stone. Have yourself a good evening.
Thank you very much.
Good night.
Appreciate it.
Good night.